Well, hello there, and welcome to the Business of Story. If this is your first time here, I'm your host, Mark Howell. If you are a longtime listener, thank you. And I'm so glad that you're here today with us because we have a very interesting international expert with us who provides analysis of how stories work, the uses of story in human life, and the reasons we tell stories in the first place. His name is Peter Brooks, and he is the Sterling Professor of Comparative Literature, Emeritus at Yale University. And his argument in his new book, Seduced by Story, is that maybe storytelling and narrative is far too prevalent in our political and business worlds today. So that's what we're going to cover. Settle in, sit back, and enjoy this special edition of The Business of Story. We're coming to the close of 2023, and you know what a year it has been. If you're planning to upskill the storytelling talents of your people in 2024 so that their messages land right the first time, every time, to grow their persuasive powers, their influence, to create a common storytelling language in your company, all in the name of business and brand growth and sales revenue growth, then shoot me a note to park@businessofstory.com. I would love to help you with anything and everything from a special keynote address for your team to my ongoing mastery course and deliberate practice program, one-on-one coaching, or of course, you can take advantage of my online course, the ABTs of Agile Communications at businessofstory.com/ABT. Now, you also might be interested in my new peer group / mastermind that I'm just pulling together and will be launching in early next year. But I'm only going to have a limited number of seats. And the whole goal here is to help you excel through the stories you tell while you get a chance to network with like-minded business people, work on your business and sales communications and storytelling challenges with a very involved cohort, and to even take advantage of one-on-one coaching with me. Now, if that sounds of interest to you, again, please shoot me a note to park@businessofstory.com. Some of my customers from this year who have been installing the 3 proven narrative frameworks from the Business of Story include, and I would like to give them a big shout out and thank you, to Walmart Canada, the Home Depot, Microchip, the University of Dayton Leadership Center, Motif Medical Maternity, the U.S. Air Force, the National Association of Music Merchants, Honor Health, and of course our good friends at Goodwill of Central and Northern Arizona, just to name a few. I would love to put your name and your organization on this incredible list of forward-thinking brands for Business of Story training in 2024. So just shoot me a note at park@businessofstory.com, and I promise to get right back to you. Now let's dive into what today's guest calls the seduction of story.
I think the storyteller has to be careful about the sources of story, right? What I call the epistemology of narrative, which is a fancy term for just saying, how did the storyteller get to know that, right? How does the narrator know what he's telling you? Can you test that? Can you ask, where did you get that story? How do you know it's true? That's important. And I think then also the storyteller has to think about how the story is going to affect the chosen listener or listeners.
In addition to being a Sterling Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature at Yale University, Peter Brooks is also the founding director of the Whitney Humanities Center. He taught also at the University of Virginia and Princeton, and as a visitor at Oxford University, the University of Bologna, and the University of Copenhagen. His expertise in publishing really focuses on narrative, psychoanalysis, and law, largely in the 19th and 20th century literature. In addition, he is author of 2 novels, World Elsewhere and The Emperor's Body. His critical books include The Melodramatic Imagination, Reading for the Plot, Troubling Confessions, Realist Vision, Henry James Goes to Paris, Enigmas of Identity, Flaubert in the Ruins of Paris, Balzac's Lives, and his latest book, which we will be discussing today, Seduced by Story, the Use and Abuse of Narrative. So please welcome to the Business of Story, Peter Brooks. It's so great to have you here. Now, my good friend and fellow Harvard grad, as you are, Dr. Randy Olson, who studied evolutionary biology there and then went on to USC, became a filmmaker, and he and I have been working on this narrative framework called the And But Therefore that he taught me over a decade ago. And of course, I've been in the business storytelling world for almost 40 years in sales, branding, marketing, and so forth. And it was Randy who first told me about your work and your current book, Seduced by Story, The Use and Abuse of Narrative. And I just thought this is really fascinating because I think maybe for the first time in almost 500 episodes over 8 years, I have someone that's coming in potentially with a different view about narrative and story in the business world, in the political world, in the lawyering world, and across the board. And so I really welcome you being here today, Peter, and I look forward to hearing your insights on this, starting with chapter 1. And let me just read the title for you real quick. Stories Abounding, the World Overtaken by Narrative.
Yes, a friend of narrative. I've been studying narrative, teaching narrative, writing about narrative for many decades, but it occurs to me that somehow narrative has taken over reality in ways that are not always beneficent. And that, at least, is the initial motivation of this book, Seduced by Story, The Use and Abuse of Narrative. So I talk mainly in the beginning, in the first chapter that you singled out, about abuses. And then I get on to other uses, trying to offer what I think of as a kind of hygiene in thinking about narrative and the way it's used in all sorts of domains in our society.
And do you think that society in general is literally abusing narrative for its own purposes?
I think there are many organizations, let's say, within society that have subscribed to a sort of total storification of reality, as if there were no other way to talk about our lives and the world in which we live. And this I see as potentially dangerous. It came to me first listening to George W. Bush introduce his cabinet, where he said each person has got their own story that is so unique. And then he went on to talk about Colin Powell as a great American story. And then Norman Mineta, he just said, I love his story. And it came to me that narrative was the only form in which Bush seemed to understand reality. And I think that's dangerous. I think that it can become non-analytic and simply a way to get people to subscribe to your point of view. And I think we've seen this more and more as time has gone on. Stories, powerful stories, can become monolithic and they can turn into myths. Myths that mobilize people, as on January 6th, to do things. And so I think we need to be a little bit suspicious of this power of storytelling.
Is it safe to say, Peter, that story, of course, has been around since the beginning of recorded history? Well, even before that. But from what we know and look at, and that we as Homo sapiens really use story to make meaning out of the madness of being human beings, to try to use narrative as an organizing, planning, force to pull in the other storytelling apes around us and get us to do something, hopefully for the good. But I know it can be used for evil as well. But it just seems like narrative has abounded since the beginning of time.
I think absolutely since the beginning of time. And if you think of myths in so-called primitive societies, a misnomer, of course, they tend to explain how we got to be the way we are, right? They are ways of talking about what we can't logically explain. Origin stories, for instance. Where did man come from, for instance? So stories are enormously important, and all religions are based on certain stories about revealed truth and how it came to be. But nonetheless, that's no reason to accept them uncritically. So what I'm trying to do is insert a little bit of doubt into this general storification of reality.
And would you agree with the thought, or not, that when we are trying to connect with that human being across from us, that as Jonathan Haidt, famous social American psychologist, would say, that our brains are story processors, not logic processors, and that we use that story first to set the context for the scene. And yes, of course, every storyteller has an agenda, right? Because we are telling that story or that joke or that anecdote to trigger a reaction out of our audience one way or the other. So, like, let's go back when you were talking about George Bush, Colin Powell. He has a great story, but you were saying people, if they hear just the story, they're not maybe thinking critically enough about the individual or the institution or the initiative. And so, does that mean that we would lead more with the data, the numbers, the logic, and the reason before that story?
No, I don't think so. I think storytelling is part of our nature as sociable animals. It's the way we make contact with other people and tell them where we're coming from, who we are. So I'm not against that use of story at all. I think it just, when it loses its critical edge, we're in trouble. When it becomes massive and all explanatory. I mean, if you think of, let's take an example, not from the present moment, but from Germany in 1933, say, when stories that explained inflation and explained the collapse of German society and so on, and blamed it all on the Allies who had defeated Germany in the First World War. These things then led to reality being overtaken by a massive and monolithic story. And that's what worries me.
And you see that really across all dictatorships, right? They will revise the narrative, revise history and the story to get people to believe in it into something new and, very often mythological, but we also see that in capitalist societies as well. I mean, our politicians, certainly are happy to use stories to peddle proper information and fake news.
Absolutely. And they each have a story which may or may not be related to the factual reality on the ground. Yes. And you mentioned capitalist society, and it's very interesting to me, and this is one of the big motivations of my book, to see how much American corporations have taken to storytelling to push their products, and push not just their products, push themselves as corporate persons. You go to any corporate website and it will tell you what our story is or our backstory and why we should believe them and think they're good guys. And why is that? And why is it that story has overtaken other forms of product backing and promotion? I mean, I'm old enough to remember the singing commercial,
Oh, yeah.
right? I can even cite a number of them from memory. Why did the singing commercial get completely replaced by storytelling about products? You probably can tell me better than I know myself.
Well, Peter, I did some exploration work in Hollywood storytelling when I was realizing that our old form, a traditional form of advertising, simply wasn't working in the digital age because people were absolutely bombarded with content. And I won't say stories. I'm just saying massive amounts of information that people thought were stories. And I went to Robert McKee, the legendary screenwriter. He's got that famous story seminar for screenwriters. And I went with my son, who is an aspiring filmmaker. And he went as a screenwriter, and I went as a marketing person because I wanted to know, what does Hollywood know and teach that we could use in the business world to hack through the noise and hook into the hearts of customers, that are being bombarded by this cacophony of communication. And McKee, of course, being the story guy, said, stories are the creative conversation of life itself into a more powerful, clearer, more meaningful experience. They are the currency of human contact. So if that is true, if
That's
his
good.
premise is true, of course, we use stories over logic and reason because of that social animal human contact, no?
I think that's absolutely true. And I also think we use story because story is about things that happen in time. And we as human beings are time bound in a way that we're not place bound, for instance. So I've called plot the logic of meanings that develop in time, for instance. So I think that that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, they are very temporal. And when I was sitting in his session, he said something to me, and again, not to me, to the audience, but struck me as if he was talking to a marketer, even though he was talking to screenwriters, about 200 of them in the room. And this kind of goes back to your original thought of, why do we lean into story so much? Well, of course, we use them and buy with them because they're emotional. They trigger an emotion, and we purchase with our hearts and justify that purchase with our heads. And he said it to the screenwriters like, you have to understand your protagonist and your audience in a godlike way, because you have to write stories that have so much subtext that invites that audience in, that audience is subconsciously going along and kind of, either poking holes in your story or following along with it. And the line that really caught me is he said, our conscious mind is simply the PR department for our subconscious mind, where all the real decisions are being made.
That's good. Yes, I think it's very important to talk not only about tellers of stories, but listeners to stories. Not only narrators, but what came to be known in my field as the narratees, those people who are addressed by stories, either explicitly or implicitly. And so I'm very, very much interested in literary texts which staged listeners, something like Conrad's Heart of Darkness, to take a famous example, which shows the reaction of listeners to the story that's been told within the tale. So I think that focus on what listeners are taking in and what they're going to do with what they take in is extremely important.
Can you share with us what that example or exercise is for our listeners? I'm not familiar with it. This is a study of story listening.
I've written a couple of books on narrative. I suppose the best known is one called Reading for the Plot, which was first published in 1986. And Seduced by Story is kind of a sequel to it. But there are a number of stories which we call frame tales, right? Because there is a story told within the outer frame of the story. And it's been used by many great storytellers from Balzac, Kipling, and I mentioned Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where the story is actually being told on shipboard, on a boat called the Nelly that's anchored in the Thames, waiting for the turn of the tide to make its voyage out. And at the end, the listeners seem to be very puzzled. And the only reaction, the only verbal reaction, as I remember, is that the head of the company says, "We've missed the turn of the tide." They got so absorbed in this story that they've missed the moment at which they were supposed to set sail down the river. But then the whole river then becomes like the heart of an impenetrable darkness. The darkness that the story tells about becomes the darkness that envelops its listeners, because it's a very dark tale indeed. And I'm very much interested in stories like this. And Conrad is one of our great storytellers. And as he said in a famous preface, my whole purpose in life is to make you see the story. And that attempt, to make you really present in the story, very important.
Well, you talked about your book, Reading for Plot, that you published in 1984. And if you look back on that, you think about it, Reagan was starting his second term. The first Apple Macintosh came out for $2,500. We were still pretty much in an analog world with the written word and written communication and so forth. Digital was just taking off, right? So when you look back on the writing of that book to where we are now, number one, what triggered you to write that book in the first place, and how have you seen this whole idea around narrative and story evolve over the past 40 years?
Yeah, well, I undertook the book partly because I had been teaching a great deal about story and started a a new course and then a new program at Yale University. And a lot of my inspiration, I've got to say, came from French sources. The French had picked up on what they then dubbed the French love neologisms narratology. That means the sort of study of narrative, the analytic study of narrative. And really, their great predecessors were the Russian formalists, a remarkable group after the Russian Revolution who flourished and were very much interested in the constructedness of stories, how they're made. Vladimir Propp wrote this wonderful book called The Morphology of Folktale, showing the sort of repeated structure of all folktale. They were suppressed by Stalin when Stalin came along. So I had been teaching all this stuff, and then I decided that I'd write a book about it. And at that point, it was relatively new, I would say. And by now, if you went back to it, you might still find it very readable, but the ideas would probably seem to you very much in current use, right? And that's the motivation of the second book. Where did this takeover of reality by story come from? And how, in that time span since 1984 to the present moment, has so much changed? You mentioned Ronald Reagan, and it seems to me he was maybe the first of our presidents who used story very effectively. I mean, he loved to tell anecdotes. Gary Wills, in his book called Reagan's America, claims that some of those stories didn't come from reality, but from films that Reagan had played a role in, that he confused with reality. But anyway, he tended to govern by anecdote, by the telling short story that illustrated a point, like the welfare mom who, so on. And I think that really was one of the most powerful examples of the power of storytelling to govern people. And we've gone on from there.
Well, and it's so powerful. I mean, that's what marketers, and that's what we preach, quite honestly, Peter, here on the show and the work I do, is don't lead with features and functions and data points and numbers. You know, what's the first syllable of numbers?
Right.
Right? Unless you place them in the context of a human story that our brain can understand, then those numbers just bounce off our head like, satellites skipping off the atmosphere. So it's
Right.
no surprise that Reagan was very effective with that. And then people said, hey, that actually works. Let's use it today. And I think that kind of led to your idea of the storification of reality. Is that a bad thing? Or are you thinking that these people are using story to overwhelm emotion and people then don't buy into the reality of what's really going on?
I don't think stories in themselves are bad or good. I think they can be used for good or for bad ends. And that's what worries me, that there seems to be an assumption, and it's true of a lot of people in universities as well, that stories are automatically on the side of the angels, and it just isn't so.
I like that. That story's on the side of angels. Is that what you just said?
Right. I don't think they are in those stories side of angels. And I cite that wonderful story by Jorge Luis Borges called Clun Ukbar and Orbis Tertius, which is about the creation of a world where everything is idealized and everything is symmetrical, and it's a dangerous world. It's like fascism, right? Everything has to march to the same story, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And Borges is very skeptical of that. So that's what I'm really preaching is skepticism more than anything else.
So if you hear a good story out there and it really connects you deep emotionally, you're feeling like, man, I am in the sway of this story. Is it that we need to stop, take a breath, and then level this content up to our logical reason brain and now suss it out to make sure that it's making sense?
Yes, and ask how it's put together and what might be the different ways in which you could tell the same incident in a story. I mean, I've been much interested in the law and the way law tells stories, and storytelling is enormously important in the law at all levels, in the courtroom, in appellate decisions, all the way on up to the Supreme Court. But law rarely steps back and says, how are we telling this story? And, particularly when you get up to appellate courts or the Supreme Court, the story has become retold several times and it's taken on a kind of reality of its own. And sometimes you have to stop and say, look, is that the only way that the facts combine? Is that the only way we can tell this story? So I'm urging that there's a distinction between living and telling. And in the law, the law says just the facts, ma'am, but the facts are rarely meaningful until they've been put together in a story.
You do a lot of work and have a fascination in law, right? And the use of storytelling in law. And in fact, our good friend Doug Passon, who's a defense attorney out here in Arizona, there's a great show I sent you. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it, it might be worth your listen, how he uses story in, sentence mitigation and so forth. It's episode number 341 for the rest of you out there. But why do you think that maybe lawyers aren't as good as storytellers, or are they better than your average bear storyteller?
I think they're often great storytellers. I just finished teaching a course at Yale Law School with a colleague, a law school colleague, Robert Post, on narrative in law and literature. And I think one thing we discovered is that law is full of great stories. What it's lacking sometimes is the power to analyze its own stories. And when you reach, constitutional adjudication, I think back to Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the case where Roe versus Wade was reaffirmed with some modifications, where three of the judges, Justices Souter, O'Connor, and Kennedy, told a very moving story about the Constitution itself. They call it a covenant, linking different generations of Americans. And they say that the court has to be faithful to this covenant and not deviate too much, essentially, from the narrative that's been told about the Constitution and about the American people from the beginning. And it seems to me we're seeing a violation of this covenant in recent Supreme Court decisions, and it's got a lot of people upset, and rightly so. Set aside for a moment the content of the decisions, the way they're being done seems to be terribly arrogant in relation to the story that's been built up over the past and to the present. And I think this is something that people are dimly aware of and need to be more analytic about.
Are people getting outwitted by good storytellers?
Well, I think people are outwitted by good storytellers all the time, yes.
Who in the commercial world, a big brand or whatever, do you feel is using and abusing storytelling? And maybe the stories they're telling do not add up for how they're actually showing up in the world.
Well, I looked at a number of stories on websites, and most of them are fairly innocent. I mean, Tom's of Maine will tell you how they moved to Maine and started making toothpaste that didn't have any chemical additives, and that seems pretty much on the right side of things. Mm-hmm. But then there are other stories which just seem sort of self-justifying without any real weight for the consumer. One was furniture I was looking at. I was at Wayfair. Not sure that I want to identify it since I might misidentify it, which tells you the story of how the creators met in college and went on to study entrepreneurship and stuff. And it's a nice story, but you say, why should I trust the product on the basis of this silly story? So,
well, the argument, of course, Peter, to that in business is people buy from people, not companies or brands. And so people like to tell their story of why do you do, Simon Sinek has made a legendary career out of the why. What's your why story? Why do you do what you do? The how and the what just simply backs up your story as to why.
Yeah, but I want the story of the product, not the story of the producers. Yeah. Right? I want to know, is this a good, solid desk, not how you came to manufacture it or market it.
So your logic and reason brain comes in and says, just tell me if this thing is sturdy and if it's going to last me 20 years, and is it made of oak or mahogany, and I'll take it from there.
Right, exactly. No, I think you want to be convinced by stories, and there are just so many stories that seem to me miss the mark. And I guess that's your domain, right? How to find stories or tell stories that hit the consumer on the nose.
Yeah, I often say I'm one of my own beliefs, and you can feel free to not believe it, anyone out there, but that stories deliver a truth that creates the trust. And I say that even when people are telling inaccurate stories or write out lies, I think eventually, and the more powerful they are, the more obvious that lie becomes, and the truth ultimately wins out if people look at it with, a critical enough mind. So, of course, in our marketing world, there's a lot of hyperbole out there, and people tell lots of stories. But as the critical reader and/or story listener, that you have to really take in and understand. All right, where are we going emotionally with this, and then logically, how can I back this up? A la Robert McKee.
Yes, good. But what if you were facing a country like ours at the moment, which is so profoundly divided and gets its stories from very different sources, which say very different things, and so that we're no longer sharing a common reality? I find that very, very troubling.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. And what with that vacuum, that void is the middle, the bell curve where most of us reside. The vast majority of us are not on the right or far left. How come those leaders in the middle seem to do a really poor job of telling a story that brings people together versus those that are completely dividing us?
Yeah, well, that's you've nailed it. That's a very troubling and important question, and I don't know the answer except that the stories on the extreme, on the fringes, seem to sell better than the stories of unity and common purpose.
Is that because they're so negative that it just plays to our negativity bias as a Homo sapien storytelling monkey?
Well, I think they enlist resentment, which is a very powerful emotion, and feeling of marginalization and powerlessness. And we all feel a certain powerlessness in contemporary society, right? Because we don't have our hands on the levers of power anymore, if we ever did. So I think that they're able to scream louder and with more vituperation and more extreme language, and that's effective, alas.
And that's extreme language is like the fireworks that go off that says, hey, look at me, pay attention to me. And now I'm going to fill your head with a lot of fallacy.
Yeah, right. I think that's absolutely right.
So I was thinking about a story going awry after I asked you, what's a brand out there that might be doing that? The one that keeps hitting me, and what is this, a decade old now, is Volkswagen. When they were telling the story of how energy efficient they were and green. And then, of course, they got caught in that whole diesel engine debacle, and their entire story blew up around them, and they had to come back out and reinvent themselves with a new story.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting example. I'm not sure they've ever completely recovered
Right.
from that debacle. I mean, I don't know anything about their sales figure, but it seems to me they continue to fight against a certain negative valence that's given to their product.
Do you think in all of your studies and look at story, and of course, working in major institutions like Yale, you certainly have logic and reason driving. I mean, had the fortunate chance of working at Arizona State University for 5 years as an adjunct communications instructor on storytelling, and was working through the School of Sustainability and working with very large brands on how they could do a better job of communicating their internal initiatives, primarily to get their people on board, to rally them around social cause, environmental causes, and that kind of thing. And so I learned a lot about, wow, you get into these institutions and you're working with PhDs and whatever, and they get in that stovepipe hat of logic and reason, and they try to repel any stories coming in. And yet there's still that Homo sapien, just like the rest of us, that those stories still have impact on them. So, for instance, in your work, where do you toggle between the emotion of story of a good narrative or anecdote told to make your point, then backed up with the logic, reason, the numbers, the data to proof out your story. Where is the balance in that?
Good question. I mean, I think that logic and reason, syllogism, can be ways of repressing the truth as well as ways of expressing the truth. I'm very much interested, though I don't know a great deal about it, in the movement of narrative medicine, which is identified by with Rita Caron and her students at Columbia Medical School, which starts from the very simple idea that you should listen to patients and listen to their stories. And I think most of us have had that experience of going to doctors and feeling that they're not listening to what we're saying, that they are presenting some, diagnosis or some complex that they think applies, but doesn't really fit with our story. So I think that, people in universities and elsewhere have to be made to listen to stories before they can go forward.
I was during my tenure there, I was invited to a lunch with famous science fiction writer Margaret Atwood. And at that table was about 12 of us, I guess. 10 of them were PhDs. The other two, one guy, Peter Bick, was a documentary filmmaker who teaches documentary filmmaking at ASU. And then there was me, the soft-skilled story guy, no PhD, right? So as we went around and introduced ourselves, by the way, the topic of this particular lunch was, does science fiction have any place in science? Which I thought was just a marvelous talking point. And so they had the director of the Origins project there. And anyways, they were going around the table and everyone was making their claim. And when I introduced myself, of course, as a non-PhD story guy, they all kind of like dismissed me. I mean, you could feel the energy in the room. And my good pal, Dr. George Basil, who was sitting next to me, who is a PhD, but also a brilliant marketer, kind of looked at me and sort of chuckled, because he knew I was going to be on the hot seat. So anyways, this goes on for about 20, 30 minutes conversation. And one of the doctors in there says, you know what? I'm getting kind of tired of this conversation. I don't believe science fiction has any place in science. We need to be rooted in the scientific method, numbers, data, and that's it. And so then I had to pipe up right there, Peter. I said, well, if that's true, then how about JFK, John F. Kennedy, and his Rice University speech when he was trying to sell the Apollo program? And he says, we are going to build a 33-story rocket built of metal alloys that do not exist, propels by fuels that we're going to have to invent, navigated, 250,000 miles across the universe to the moon and back again with systems that yet to be developed, and we're going to land the man there and safely return him within this decade. I said, if that's not science fiction guiding science through the power of story, I don't know what is. And I promptly got dismissed by that doctor. She turned and looked and said, we haven't heard from you, Dr. Smith, yet. And I looked over at Margaret Atwood, and she just kind of gave me a knowing little nod like, touche, buddy. But there's another example to me, leadership and using story to get the masses to picture. I mean, it's total fiction at that point, is it not? But organizing, planning, and illustrating what tomorrow could be, and then all of us storytellers have to deliver on the promises we make in those stories.
That's absolutely right. And I just look at the popularity of the Oppenheimer film. And I've also just recently looked at a documentary that's been revived called The Day After Trinity about Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer has become a story about America at a certain point, right? It's a story about a kind of tragic person, but also it's a story about what we became following the blast in New Mexico.
Yeah, in fact, my wife and I just watched Oppenheimer last night. I hate to tell you, Peter, I fell asleep twice. It was too long. But my question is, it was really good done, well done. I'm a big fan of Christopher Nolan. But I also had to ask myself throughout, how accurate is this particular story?
Well, that's why I would also recommend the documentary, The Day After Trinity, which just mainly It's talking to the scientists who were working with him on the Manhattan Project, including his brother, who's very eloquent and moving. And yeah, but the question you ask is a good one because now Oppenheimer has become a myth, and we can't probably ever get to the true story, whatever it is.
Yeah. Is there any such thing as a true story? Because it seems as
Well,
we're notorious as a species as remembering things differently.
you're absolutely right. But look, in the law, for instance, people go to prison or even go to execution on the basis of stories, right? Stories which carry enough conviction with a judge or with a jury that they are convicted of a crime and put away. So we have, without stories, there could be no law. There could be no juries, there could be no verdicts. So we're dependent on story, even though, as you say, we have to be quite suspicious of the weight we give to it and the way we decide whether it's a true story or not.
Have you read Yuval Harari's book *Sapiens* and how he covers story in that?
Yeah, I've looked at that. Yeah. No, I mean, I think story has some evolutionary biologist I was reading, and I can't remember who said, storytelling is like a compass we use when we get lost in the woods. It's one of our basic orientation devices in the world, and it has been since the emergence of Homo sapiens.
So, advice for two different groups. First, the storyteller. Peter, what would you share with them from your book, Seduced by Story, and just your overall body of work, which is immense over the years, about as a storyteller, what to be careful of?
I think the storyteller has to be careful about the sources of story, right? What I call the epistemology of narrative, which is a fancy term for just saying, um, how did the storyteller get to know that, right? How does the narrator know what he's telling you? Can you test that? Can you ask, where did you get that story? How do you know it's true? That's important. And I think then also the storyteller has to think about how the story is going to affect the chosen listener or listeners.
And then from the listening standpoint, what do they have to be careful about?
Well, I think Ernest Hemingway put it quite well, where he said, the writer has to have a good built-in shit detector, and listeners especially have to have that. So we can say, that really cannot be the case. Let's look at it from a different angle.
Yeah, let's get real, or at least see if
That's
we can
getting
find reality in it.
right.
Speaking of Hemingway, I'm curious what your take on this. You probably have heard his shortest story ever told.
Yes, I long ago though.
And the tale is such that he's sitting in a bar with a bunch of his buddies, and he says, "I bet I can make you cry in 6 words." And they all took the bet, and supposedly he won $10 off of each one because he did. And here were the 6 words that they now claim as the shortest story ever told: for sale, baby shoes, never worn.
Well, you might cry or you might laugh, right? Depending on your mood.
But the first reaction, and when I do this in workshops, and I got to be very careful because sometimes I won't do it at all because people actually get offended by it. But the vast majority of the room will say, well, the baby obviously died. The baby is no longer
Right.
with us. The baby's out of here. And I mean, sometimes people will gasp and I'll always pull them out and I'll say, why'd you gasp? Well, the baby obviously died. And then I ask the question, why? Why could it have been a positive outcome? Mom and dad go to the store, they buy the shoes, they don't realize how healthy their baby is. It's too big for the darn shoes they just bought and they couldn't take them back,
Well, you make the point that we all fill in gaps in the stories we hear, right? And we all interpret them as we listen to them. Yeah. And I think most people would interpret it that gasping way that the baby has died.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because it's the negativity bias. It brings closure
right.
to an open loop story that then we, as that storytelling monkey, have to close because you've let us out on a ledge. but you haven't told us how it ended, so we make up the ending ourselves. And I'll use that as an example in leadership communications and business communications. If you are standing in front of your team and you are unclear, maybe you open a story loop and you invite them in, but you don't effectively close it with a call to action to ask them to do this next thing or what it is you want them to think about, that brain will automatically close it for you. And it won't be the story you intended unless you intentionally tell them that story.
Right. I mean, stories are not innocent. They have designs on you. And that's why we tell them very often, but listeners ought to be aware that someone telling them a story is after something.
There's an agenda attached to every story, no?
Right. I mean, stories are seductive and often are used to seduce. Yep.
Well, Peter, thank you so much. Loved your book, Seduced by Story, The Use and Abuse of Narrative. If you are open, you should definitely go on Doug Passon's podcast. It's just excellent about the use of story in law. And I did watch that. I was impressed by it. Yeah, you and he would have a marvelous conversation. And you should maybe also go on Dr. Randy Olson's podcast. Of course, he talks about narrative big time. He's very versed in it, studied the and but therefore that he and I work with quite a bit. And I think you guys would have a lot of fun on that show too.
Good.
Anyways, thank you for being here. Where can people find you and your book?
They can find me on my Yale website in the Department of Comparative Literature, and the book is published by NYRB, New York Review Books, and you can find it on their website.
All right. Final closing question for you, Peter. What scares you about story in this over-reliance of narrative on society?
I am scared that reality may be knocked out of business by story. I mean, the story of a stolen election, for instance. And there now are a great many of our fellow countrymen who believe that. And I think that's scary, and I'm not sure that any of us knows quite how to react to that.
And we have a whole nother episode at some point. I'd love to have you back because I would love to talk to you about narrative storytelling and AI and what you think that the impact AI may have on this business of storytelling.
Wow. Yeah.
Maybe that's your next book. Who knows? Peter, thank you so much for being here. And thank you all for listening, watching this edition of The Business of Story. If you liked what you heard, feel free to share it with your friends, family, colleagues, any of those that are, studying storytelling or trying to really understand how to use narrative for good and not evil. Certainly share this episode with them. Thank you so much for listening. Until next week, when we'll have another amazing story artist right here for you. Remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make that epic. Thanks so much for listening. Before we close today's show, I would like to give a huge shout out to one Chris Davidson. Chris is the Communications and Creative Director at World Impact, and he was so kind earlier this week when he posted the following on LinkedIn. Quote, "They say you become like the people you spend the most time with. So I'm grateful for how the following folks have helped to shape me over the last year through their podcast discussions." End quote. Now, at the top of the list was, yours truly, and I'm absolutely honored to be named with such legendary people and shows as the We Are For Good podcast, co-hosted by Becky Endicott and John McCoy. The Duct Tape Marketing podcast, hosted by my friend, John Jantz. Included in the list is Julia Campbell's Nonprofit Nation show and Dave Stachowiak's Coaching for Leaders. Thanks, Chris, for taking a moment to share your thoughts about our shows. Because, you know what? You never know the impact you're actually having on people and the world because, most of it goes unmentioned. So we truly appreciate it. I also really appreciate the editing work of Caden Howell on our show, the custom music that was composed by Darius Holbert, and of course our community development and amazing marketing by Marissa Hill. Thank you for making our show sound incredible. I hope you'll join us next Monday when we will have Dan Heath with us. I'm tickled about this interview because the book he co-wrote with his brother Chip, called Made to Stick, is one of my all-time favorites. Dan will be here to talk about his new podcast called What's It Like to Be Me? No, it's not about Dan, but about his interesting collection of guests, from mystery novelists to high school principals to stadium beer vendors. That's right, that's coming this Monday, and I'm curious, what's it like to be you, knowing that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself? So make that one epic. Thanks so much for listening.